What do Blue Labour in the UK, JD Vance and the MAGA movement in the US, and academic political theorist Patrick Deneen all have in common? They can all be described as post-liberals, a growing body of politicians, pundits and academics who think that liberalism needs to be destroyed. It's tempting to dismiss these figures as misguided, whose political agenda rests on a flawed interpretation of liberalism with no coherent alternative. But given Trump's return to the White House and Nigel Farage's ascent in the polls in the UK, dismissing post-liberalism is no longer viable. That is why my guest today is Paul Kelly, a political theorist at the London School of Economics. Paul is the author of several books, including his most recent publication, Against Post-Liberalism, which we discuss in today's episode. If you enjoy the episode, make sure to rate the podcast wherever you listen. You can also follow the show on Instagram, @IdeasMatterPod. Thanks for listening. Paul Kelly, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure.
So we should set the stage for our listeners who might not be familiar with your body of work. So perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about your research interests in general and how these interests sort of led you to feel that you needed to write a book on post-liberalism.
Okay, that's a good start. So I'm a political theorist at the London School of Economics. I've been here for 35 years. I work on a broad range of issues in political theory. I wrote a book on liberalism, a kind of defense of liberal egalitarianism, back in 2005. I then went away and became a kind of university manager, came back into regular academic life and started to re-find my feet. So how did I come to post-liberalism? Well, there were a couple of things that kind of track that biographical story. So I'm still broadly sympathetic to, happy to defend a version of liberal egalitarianism. That's kind of where I stand. And then the interesting thing for me is how that's regarded, both, and it was two things, both politically and in the academy. So, going back to teaching political theory, to talking to students, to seeing what colleagues were writing, I saw that a lot of the debates and arguments that were part of my early career, particularly things around, out of the liberal communitarian debate, liberalism, multiculturalism, and so on, which one had thought had sort of moved on or, had been settled, were still there. Okay, and still being reproduced. And then the other interesting bit was that was also being done within, certainly British politics, which is kind of when I started, particularly on the sort of centre left, with the rise of what I came to describe as post-liberalisms, but things like the Blue Labour movement in British politics, which were a reaction against Tony Blair, Gordon Brown's commitment to trying to meld under the third way some version of, the neoliberal global settlement and, broadly social democratic values of equality and redistribution and so on. That came to an end, obviously, post-2008. They lost power in 2010. And then there was this sort of movement to get beyond the tyranny of neoliberalism, right? So that began as a kind of interesting conversation, but the way it developed shifted more and more to the right, particularly in terms of a sort of social conservative agenda, and then the near abandonment of what looked like the left element of that, the commitment to redistribution and some reorganization, political equality, and so on. So those were the very early drivers. This movement started to grow and attract new voices. So by the time I was kind of invited to work on a book in the area that post-liberalism against post-liberalism sort of ended up in. And then, of course, there was the post-16 sort of US side of it, with the slightly more strident contribution from American post-liberals, following on from Patrick Deneen. So it was a mixture of both a political interest and a sort of political philosophical interest, and how those things either connected or in some ways were also a mismatch, as I looked at what my colleagues were working on, and they seemed to be further and further remote from this area of political challenge. So that was my driver. And then there's a few other biographical issues in the book which may come up and so on. So I've always been kind of interested in the ways in which associative obligations and membership and so on fits with or doesn't fit with, or the challenge of fitting it with, a broadly liberal egalitarian order. Those are the reasons.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I guess your answer kind of highlights one of the many things that I liked about the book, in that when you talk about post-liberalism, you're not just talking about academic critiques of liberalism. You make quite a point to talk about JD Vance in the United States, who I think is a self-identified post-liberal. But you also mentioned in your answer Blue Labour. And I know what Blue Labour is, but perhaps for the members of our audience from the US and Australia who are not as familiar with UK politics, could you just perhaps briefly tell us what Blue Labour is?
Okay, so Blue Labour, I mean, the title is supposed to reflect, the party colours, but also the sort of challenge that this brings. So the blue is broadly conservative in UK politics, but the Labour Party isn't. The Labour Party is the sort of centre-left, traditional Labour Party as one would expect it to be. So it's the title of the group is indicating something quite specific, insofar as there's a theory behind it. And this is the position of people like Maurice Glasman, who people can look up. He's all over social media. John Rutherford, John Cruddas, who actually wrote a nice blurb for the book, but was interested in this at the time. These were part of the sort of centre-left tradition, who came from perhaps a more socially conservative background, possibly Catholic. Maurice isn't; he's a Jew, practicing Jew, but people who come with a kind of bigger philosophical, theological perspective that their Labour politics fits in, and then to see that in terms of the primary driver. So it began linking community and class, and that's why I say it was seen to be both a sort of socially conservative but also a very leftist radical view that fits into the growth of populism. But it was also very self-consciously challenging the sort of sort of hyper-liberalism that was seen to be associated with left politics. And it's actually that becomes the crossover with Vance and the movement in the US, where that sort of hostility to sort of hyper-liberalism is the real driver. They're against pretty much everything that liberal egalitarians are concerned with. But it was a political movement, and there was a kind of less important but nevertheless real sort of red Tory group, which was the same thing on the other side. Now, the big thing they were looking for, and this is the last bit I'll say on it, is they were looking for a new political economy after the financial crash and so on. That could have been a sort of corporatist version. So it was supposed to be a challenge to the sort of neoliberal capitalist order. But that very much, certainly since 2016, seems to have disappeared in favor of that sort of populist shift to the right that you see with, the people underneath or alongside Trump and that movement, and the same on the political right in the UK.
Mm. Interesting. So I guess I think you do use this term in the book. You describe them as left post-liberals, and in a sense, I guess they're like communitarians in a way who feel that the neoliberal turn, or the third way, as it was called in the UK context, sort of abandoned these more kind of communal aspects of left-wing thinking, particularly with, as you said, neoliberal political economy. But I'm interested in, you mentioned that then there becomes a crossover, particularly in the critique of hyperliberalism and individualism. So I want to linger on this crossover and what makes a left post-liberal and a right post-liberal both post-liberals. And you describe in the introduction, you say that the term anti-liberalism is perhaps not sufficient to describe post-liberalism. And you say that what is unique about post-liberalism and post-liberals is that they want to annihilate liberalism. Could you just unpack what you mean by that a little bit, and why you think the term anti-liberalism is not sufficient to understand post-liberalism?
So, I mean, and it's very good to pick that point out, because if you read Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, Deneen's point is that liberalism, broadly conceived, has to fail because it's self-undermining. So it's a version of a fairly familiar argument. You find it on the Marxist left, you find it on some aspects of the political right, which kind of takes up an idea that's prevalent in Smith, that market institutions, market culture depends on certain core institutions. But the drivers of modern neoliberal capitalism undermine those things like the rule of law, stable political institutions, contract, and so on. There's all sorts of reasons why they do that. But the point is that hyper-individualist neoliberalism undermines itself. And then the post-liberals are looking, one, what's beyond that, but two, it can't be a revised version of sort of philosophical liberalism, right? Now, most of the other ideological candidates to replace political liberalism out there, conservatism, variants of socialism, all have within them, some kind of broad philosophical liberalism, broadly individualist in some way, starting in that way. And I have a wonderful short quote from Roger Scruton, one of the more vocal conservative writers of the last 20, 30 years, certainly in the UK context, but also important in Europe and the US now. And Scruton basically says that conservatism, modern conservatism, works within a framework that's kind of inherited from Locke, which is, the sort of individualistic, accumulation of knowledge. So the epistemology of liberalism is broadly individualistic and therefore consistent with, Enlightenment, natural sciences, but also the importance of popular sovereignty. And then the argument is that these forms modify and work within that framework. The debate is within something like philosophical liberalism, but the real issues are then what we should do. Now, of course, the post-liberals go to the point and say, actually, that big framework is the problem. No version of liberalism is viable. They're all self-undermining. So then they have to come back to looking for a grand narrative to displace liberalism. So it isn't just, we want to challenge ideological liberalism. We need to change the ground in which we do politics. We think philosophically about the foundations of politics, and we do that in a way that isn't liberal. So yes, it's anti-liberal, but of course the trouble with anti-liberal, to go back to the core point of your question, and also, to illustrate it, Stephen Holmes' wonderful book, The Anatomy of Anti-Liberalism from the early 90s, it's more about individual, thinkers on the right or some radical thinkers on the left who want to challenge liberalism from within that framework rather than displace it. So I was looking for a sort of language discourse which really indicates just how radical their challenge to liberalism is. And therefore, it's not just another kind of anti-liberalism. Marxism is anti-liberal. Lots of different conservatisms are anti-liberal. But the post-liberals want to be radically anti-liberal. And that, I think, is the point I was trying to capture in that way.
Yeah, that leads me quite nicely onto my next question. When you say that the post-liberals are rejecting the entire framework that liberal politics operates within, and perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong, but reading your book, it seemed to me that what is at the heart of the post-liberal critique is that they reject this core liberal idea that coercion must be justified to individuals. And you cite Jeremy Waldron in the book, who wrote that fantastic essay, The Theoretical Foundations of Liberalism, who says that this is the crux of liberalism, that all sort of social arrangements, particularly those which involve inequality and hierarchy, have to be rationally justified to the individual. And so this is the crux of liberalism. And it seems to me that that's really what the post-liberals reject. So firstly, is that correct? And secondly, this is a big question, but why do they reject that? I think you kind of alluded to it when you said that post-liberals see liberalism as self-defeating and undermining. Is it this justification? Is it the public justification aspect that undermines liberalism?
Yes. Short answer. So so if you think of the challenge that Waldron is talking about, the liberals, of course, they're not offering a reason to people for their being subject to moral political coercion that they will accept. More, it's the sort of more philosophically substantive point that they could reasonably accept or not, or have a reason not to reasonably reject that process of justification. But the crucial point is that still works in a sort of broadly democratic direction, where the authority of principles and values comes from their acceptability or non-rejectability from the recipients of those reasons. Okay, so it's a sort of bottom-up process of justifying authority. What will the people kind of accept? And that's, I suppose, also Scruton's point, saying that that even conservatism works within something broadly like popular sovereignty. It will be the people who accept the authority over them. Now, of course, the point that the post-liberals, particularly what I call the authoritarian post-liberals in the third element of my analysis, want to do is to say, no, authority doesn't work that way. Authority is a claim on people. It doesn't require their endorsement. It requires their obedience. So then justification is going to be a rather different matter in terms of the grounds of coercion. And that opens up, and I think this is why it's attractive to many, it opens up the possibility of authoritarian forms of rule that are fundamentally not democratic. Doesn't mean that anything goes, but it does want to challenge the sort of built-in primacy of a sort of democratic justification that liberals kind of take as being essential to what they think, but also which goes to other aspects of the liberal order, because it's also the sort of ethos of the market mechanism. The customers are always, the price mechanism kind of does the same thing in terms of justifying outcomes, because it is all a consequence of, individual choices and so on. So it's that element of how you call it, popular sovereignty, sovereignty of the recipients of reasons, public justification that they want to challenge in terms of making space for authority. So that was the bit I was trying to draw out. And I think that's the bit that they would want to, rely on most importantly.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of Kant's essay, An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment, in which
Yeah.
he says, have the courage to use your own understanding. And it seems that the post-liberals are saying, well, there are certain things in which you should not use your own understanding. There are certain things that are just off the table, so to speak. They're absolutely true. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, and you can see this particularly in the way in which more sort of religious-minded thinkers on the post-liberal side, take this up. They don't explicitly reject that sort of Kantian sort of prejudice, prejudgment. What they do, though, is they add the traditional thing. Yeah, but of course that judgment has to be informed. It's not just a question of, how do you feel? Or, here's the reason, except, it's a more substantive commitment, and that comes with, what makes for an informed conscience, what makes for an informed judgment, which has some authority. Because there's still obviously, for all authoritarians, some element of public justification, but it's how far that has to extend. And of course, the political challenge of that is it extends only to people like me, or people like me who recognize authority X already. Churches are a good, easy example of that, but it doesn't have to just be religious authorities. It can be conceptions of it is for Lenin, it's conceptions of the party. I mean, there's a lot of those sort of authoritarianisms. And it's that sort of looking to the authority and accepting the authority as providing both the rationale, the rationale for coercion and principle, but also providing us with an account of what good reason is, what informed reason and judgment, what right consciousness is. That's the thing that they're picking up on. And that's the sort of authoritarian style of argument that has really been out of European political discourse since 1945 for pretty obvious reasons.
I want to come back to this tension between the more religious post-liberals and then the secular post-liberals, because I find that to be really interesting. But you've mentioned the fact that you've got three facets in the book to post-liberalism, so we should just spell those out for people who haven't read the book. So you've got national populism, communitarianism, and political authoritarianism, which you just mentioned. And I quite liked the chapter on national populism, and I want to kind of like try and provoke you a little bit on this chapter, because you say that broadly speaking, national populism refers to these kind of right-wing populists who claim that liberalism is just the ideology of a progressive cultural elite, particularly tied to elite universities. And national populists are telling a story of liberalism in order to portray it as deeply elitist and hypocritical. It pretends to be progressive, but actually it denigrates working class people and the values that they hold. And, the people who espouse these liberal values are really most often just the winners from neoliberal globalization. Now, my provocation is, isn't this story pretty true? I mean, would you accept that many liberals are in fact out of touch and hypocritical? And if so, if one is still a committed liberal egalitarian, as am I, how can we address these failings in order to undercut this tale that the national populists are telling?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, here I am, late middle-aged white professor, tweed jacket, books behind me, talking about, public justification and what people think. Yes, we are an elite and we're out of. But I think the bigger picture that I wanted to to draw out from that national populist perspective. One was to bring in populist politics, because that's been the really big background to the crisis of social democracy in Europe and the UK, the collapse of that strand of politics in the United States, and the rise of MAGA populism and other kinds of populism. So it allowed me to talk about that. And of course, the populist perspective, it's not new. I even mentioned particularly people like Christopher Lasch, who were talking about this way back in the 70s and 80s, but it goes back much further. And it's an analysis of populism, it's an analysis of politics, which sees it as about elite competition and, the elite being separate from the masses. Now, the liberal critique is that it's a liberal elite. And I say a lot, obviously, about the formation of that liberal elite. The universities are part of that, favoring global labor mobility, particularly, from the brightest and the best, if you want a way of describing it, my students going into a global labor market, and how that's different from the mass. But of course, the bit that's missed out, and I wasn't writing a book on populism, so I didn't go into this. But of course, there's a genuine question about, of course, popular hostility to elites. But there's a problem with the populace. The people is not a single homogeneous, body. There's no, political science just shows this. There's no obvious, simple, public interest that the elites are diverting. So there's a fractional politics below, which is being exploited to concentrate on elite displacement. And then the political right has taken up some of that rhetoric in terms of using the elitism of the left domination, the liberal elite domination of society, to justify a challenge to it. And this is the sort of, a lot of money comes into the politics of this from US wealth and donors and think tanks and so on, who want to sort of renew, for want of a better word, a more sort of traditionalist public culture. And they do that in kind of classic Gramscian terms of, going through the core institutions of society to create a new hegemony. What does that mean? Capturing universities, arguing for opinion diversity amongst faculty, looking at, in my own country, challenging the BBC as the national public broadcaster with its single voice, and other kind of key institutions that they claim reinforce the dominance of a liberal elite. So in order to make a kind of claim about that populist assault on public institutions, you need to see it in that sort of elite versus masses populist work. But of course, empirically, it's all bogus. The kind of argument that they're talking about, that the elite is massive if you look at it in terms of what they're talking about. The university educated population in the UK, and the demographics that go with it. Yes, it's a big change, but it's also this is not some kind of small select elite of a handful of, wealthy donors of elite universities and some professors who are corrupting the minds of the youth. So empirically, there's a lot of work to challenge that, but it's that structure of argument that I wanted to work on because of the way in which it then allows political interventions.
And you mentioned in, I think, the last chapter that, one could kind of turn this critique back around on the post-liberals, because actually, if you look at the impact of right-wing populist policies, particularly in the United States under the Trump administration, they tend to benefit the real elites, i.e. the billionaires and the hyper-rich. So I guess politically, I think, do you think that the center left should, in a way, kind of copy the rhetorical strategy of the post-liberals and say, yes, you're right. It is the elite versus the masses, but it's not the liberal elite that you should be worried about. It's these other it's the it's the oligopoly, something like a Bernie Sanders style left-wing populism.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously some element of that which has to be the way forward for the centre social democratic left. And I think there's lots that can be said for why that is, but it's politically very hard to do, particularly in challenging global circumstances, and we see the sort of timidity of centre-left political parties to go for economic power, partly because much of it is concentrated, in the US amongst people who dominate a certain kind of industry. So the big challenge for the sort of cultural war side of this story is going to be social media barons and their alliance with finance capitalism, the sort of Silicon Valley thing, which you see driving Trump. Now, there's a big debate here about how much that interest converges with, protectionist, closed, political economy of, big blocks, or how much it's open, and what they're afraid of was, a sort of, well, what they were afraid of was actually Biden sort of clipping their wings with, antitrust legislation and so on. It's a sort of weak version of what Sanders wants to do, go after those oligarchs. But, when you're in a not insignificant global economy like the UK, but you're not in a dominant one, you're a little less free to, make that your fundamental part. So there's always compromises, and it's those compromises which make, which kind of feed into then this sort of populist sense that it's still the same old elite that's winning, and everybody's on the side of them, and then the anti-elitist language of insurgent populist parties saying, look, they're all the same. We have that now. And everyone voted for, or a lot of people, well, actually not a lot of people, but we had a significant parliamentary landslide for the Labour Party. And it looks very much like, things are pretty much where they were, at a sort of superficial level for British politics. So that feeds into the sort of populist sort of distrust of, grand narratives. But I think then for the rest of the story, it opens up space for people to come along and say, now what we've got to do is, attack the real challenge. But I think you're right. The fundamental challenge for the centre left is oligarchy. Not a new thing, but it's very prevalent, particularly with those sorts of economic power that can change, distort democratic politics through manipulation of social media.
Yeah, no, I read this morning that the combined net worth of Biden's cabinet was around 120 million, and the combined net worth of Trump's cabinet is 440 billion. So
Yeah.
I think the populists do like to say that they're all the same, but perhaps that's not quite true.
Yeah. And that coalition is interesting because it is the sort of the poor and the dispossessed, or some of them. The MAGA is not completely the worst off representative members of society, but they're not the wealthy. And there's insanely wealthy leadership, and it's building that kind of anti status quo elite coalition that is really the underlying challenge of that national populist element of this story.
Okay, so you've mentioned the sort of contradictory coalition, which is excellent because that was my question about communitarianism. And again, and there's a lot of merit in the communitarian critique of hyper individualism. I think you would agree with that, but very often the communitarians seem to be taking the social ontology of neoliberalism and libertarianism and ascribing that to all of liberalism, which is obviously just not the case. But you point out something which was quite interesting in your chapter on communitarianism, and that's the problem of pluralism. Perhaps the post-liberals can all kind of unite on the problem, that is liberalism and particularly liberal individualism, but there's no agreement on what's supposed to replace it. And this seems to me to be like a huge internal contradiction to the post-liberal movement. My question is, given this internal contradiction, how much should we really worry about it? Will post-liberalism just collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions?
Well, so yes, there's an important tension, and I try and explore that through the two sort of communitarian strands, so the second and the third part of the analysis of the post-liberal movement. So the first bit is the sort of standard communitarian turn to a politics of the common good, right? A sort of desiccated individualist liberalism, doesn't give us a reason it doesn't give us political values. It doesn't give us anything, to work with. It's the sort of Sandel argument about the unencumbered self. There's actually nothing there. There's nothing to choose from. Autonomy doesn't mean anything, unless you have a context for choice, which already then presupposes valuable options that, autonomy can work within. So, the philosophically interesting argument that the communitarians pose is precisely that, is how does autonomy work? And autonomy can't work in the absence of some context. And that context is either a given context, or it's that autonomy is a kind of later stage value that grows with the emergence of the individual. So kind of the story that Hegel tells us about how modern individualism arises in history. All right. So the key thing then is about the common good. The common good both provides the context for the formation of selfhood. It provides the sort of philosophical framework, and it provides us with a common resource out of which we can lead valuable lives. But then the problem with that, of course, is that works when there is a commonality to the common good. And of course, in modern liberal democratic societies, and this is the sort of modern driver for the rise of liberalism, certainly in the latter part of the 20th century, is there isn't a common good. We might all see the value of it, we might all need it, but there isn't one. There isn't one that's genuinely common, or that isn't common without some prior work. And you can kind of see Rawls as a theory of justice as an attempt to set the framework out of which, some kind of common good could emerge. So then you're right, you end up with lots of candidate theories, and the problem is one about how you address the conflict between them. Some of those conflicts are significant, some of them are more trivial, but they can all become sites of political dispute, as we see. You have on one extreme you might have religious hostility to same-sex family structure and adoption, but even within people who kind of don't go that far and still think the family is important, you've got lots of different views about how you regulate family life and relations. And there's always some need to do that. These are never fully spontaneous orders that have no politics. So there's always contestation. So the problem then is the common good doesn't seem to, it's what we need, but it's not what we can have in circumstances of pluralism. So how do you get rid of pluralism, or how do you deal with pluralism? Well, the liberals' point is you can't do anything about pluralism. Is kind of the fact of liberal modernity. This is the world we're given. We don't we arrive at it or recognize it for a whole variety of reasons, but it is kind of the world we have to confront. And then different liberalisms deal with that challenge in different ways. But authoritarians can look at this and go, yeah, liberalism is a fact, but it's not normative in that sense. And that's where the common good authoritarians come in, because they take this sort of more fundamental, there's a common good here. There is a common, the common good is what we're talking about with a definite article. And that then brings us back to the point we were talking about the sort of democratic justification and so on. If you can shift from the need to justify coercion or the legitimacy of your political structures to everyone, if you then just have to provide a different way and impose it through paternalistic legislation, you can get to a common good. You can impose, an order. And this is where you see things. I discuss the sort of integralist Catholicism of people like Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule, people who are also influential in Hungary. But you could also look at the sort of Protestant side in the United States, the sudden resurgence of interest in Christian nationalism, where this is the right way to organize civil society, and it doesn't need the majority of people to endorse it. It's the truth. And that, the truth has an authority. And if you don't agree with it, well, you're going to be made agree with it. I mean, it doesn't mean you're all going to be sent to the stake and tortured, but, it is a strong paternalist view which protects a certain kind of public life and puts obligations on everyone to respect it. So that's the sort of broad debate that's going on here, a return to paternalism. And then the grounds for that.
You sort of almost answered my next question.
That closes down the pluralism.
Yeah.
That's the pluralism Pope can agree to. Yeah, there's pluralism, but we know the truth.
Yeah. So this issue of modernity and pluralism, I think you've almost answered my follow-up question, which was I wanted to ask you why you think the political liberalism of John Rawls is a better answer to post-liberalism than the comprehensive liberalism of someone like Dworkin, and is it because of this issue of pluralism you find Rawls's way of dealing with pluralism to be more compelling?
Yes, I do. I mean, a long time ago, go back to your very first question, I was going to write a book. I was quite a way into writing a book on Ronald Dworkin, and I was very interested in his comprehensive liberalism. Back in the early 90s, this was a move in a different direction to Rawls's early statements of his political liberalism. So just before political liberalism itself was published. The more I sort of kind of worked on Dworkin, the more I found it a very, very difficult argument to square with liberalism. It's a very sophisticated, fairly subtle argument, but it has this. It's a philosophical defense of monism from a liberal perspective. So that is very significant and runs against, Isaiah Berlin and pretty much all the big figures of post Second World War European and American liberalism. But he also wants to link it to a sort of, it's almost a communitarian ethic, because it has to fit, given his idea of the continuity of, ethics, morality, politics, and law. And there he is really talking about, a discrete constitutional settlement, which is the United States. He's not making some kind of abstract. He's talking about the practice of a political community. That just, I find, deeply unpersuasive. And I think, one of the interesting quirks of the post-liberal authoritarians, Adrian Vermeule in particular, Vermeule's written this, really interesting but provocative and not ultimately persuasive book on on sort of common good constitutionalism. Okay. And Vermeule basically takes a Dworkinian view of constitutional adjudication and the nature of law, but where Dworkin says, and this is on the liberal egalitarian plateau, everything is going to be about liberal one. Vermeule just says, no, the fact under here is a different one. It's an unegalitarian sort of common good. But otherwise, the structure is very similar. And I think that's the risk of Dworkin's very sort of clever view. It's not obvious it gives you liberal outcomes, whereas Rawls is always an unfinished project. But then I kind of think that's true of liberalism. Liberalism is supposed to be both philosophically and politically an incomplete project. It's constantly looking for the appropriate justifications philosophically and politically for accommodating difference and diversity, and there won't be a simple answer to that. But as a sort of regulative idea, I think it is the more important one, partly because it also separates out the political from fundamental questions about morality and the common good. And I think the challenge that Dworkin and other high perfectionist liberals come to is that that liberalism only works if people are philosophically persuaded of the truth of liberalism. And as a political project, that is either a very long way away, or perhaps, impossible to justify, because the sources we would want to draw on, are going to be, ambiguous. Everyone has to be a Kantian, persuade everybody that, Kant is right, or whoever the other candidate theorists of the liberal order are, Mill, that people have got to be persuaded that the ultimate truth is some version of, liberal utilitarian naturalism. Liberalism is, the liberalism of Rawls brings us more closely to the challenge of politics, which is how do we try and work through the problem of pluralism without settling fundamental questions of the good, which run up to even profound things like, is there a God? Is this a created order? Is it whatever else it is? Is there anything, is there such a thing as the possibility of value out there? I think Rawls says, well, all that's great. And that's what, philosophers and so on can and should struggle with. Politics has to be different. And we can't defer politics till we've settled those things. Mm. But equally, in this last point, just on Dworkin, you can't say, but we have settled that when other people are not persuaded. And I think that's the challenge of making a common good liberalism work, because it will only persuade, those who buy into that common good liberalism. And not all liberals even do that.
So it sounds like the concern with a comprehensive liberalism is that it actually opens the door to the post-liberal vision of politics, in which we are actually having competition about the good life, and politics becomes more about moral philosophy. Is that a correct summation of what you're saying?
That's right. And that's just a short point. That's precisely Vermeule's point. He wants to set this up so that he can say, and McIntyre kind of said this as well, you liberals think that, and we don't. And there's a clash now of incommensurable conceptions of the good. You're one thing and we're the other. That's what it is. Whereas the Rawlsian project is to try and say, can we break out of that? Now, can we? We can talk more about that. But it is that view.
Yeah.
Liberalism is just another contested doctrine like Roman Catholicism or Leninist Marxism. And it will have its adherents, and it will have those who never get it.
That is exactly what I want to ask you. And perhaps you can help me with this because I've read a lot of rules and I like it a lot, but I always struggle with the claim that his conception of justice is a purely political one. And as you would know, his politics has its roots in Kant's moral philosophy. When he refers to citizens as free and equal, this comes out of Kant, right? And so
Yeah.
how would you respond to arguments that rules political philosophy actually does come out of a comprehensive doctrine? How separate is it really? I know that's a
Well,
huge question.
yeah. So there's, and I think we don't get a full and final answer, complete answer for the rules. Part of the argument is going to be a philosophical one, but part of the argument is also going to be a kind of empirical one. So, his argument is about, can we find some grounds for converging on this conception of a well-governed or a well-ordered political society that comes out of a sort of overlapping reasonable consensus between rival candidate theories of the good. Right? And part of the argument is going to be defending the idea that you can separate the right from the good. And of course, what we've just said is for the comprehensive theorists, you can't. This is Schmidt, McIntyre, all conservatives. There's no possibility of separating the right from the good. So therefore, you can't use that model of justification because it's the good all the way down. And that's true of Kant too, right? So that's one argument. But of course, that presupposes that the conception of the good really is stable and doesn't allow for that kind of compromise. And I think Rawls's sort of intuition was actually that's not the case. That in circumstances of political pluralism, people can and do make those kinds of reasonable compromises that are necessary in order to achieve some conception of reasonable or fair terms of social cooperation. So that is the sort of open-ended project of both trying to do that and looking for the way in which those coalitions between conceptions of the good, could work, could hold in wider society. Now, that might mean for some saying, oh, yes, but that just means you're trying to get us all to be Kantians. But of course, Rawls's point is you can also find resources for individualism, a kind of conception of autonomy in other sorts of philosophical sources. And, the idea that it's all Kant or nothing, or all Mill or nothing, is a kind of naive view of the history of thought. And I think, one of the interesting things I always thought, because my background, so outing myself a bit here, was one of the discussions that Rawls has is over the ideas of a Catholic Jesuit thinker, John Courtney Murray, in the United States, who was also interested in the possibility of, the legitimacy of a secular constitutional order within for people who were committed Roman Catholics. Big issue, in the 1928, Al Smith, governor of New York, Roman Catholic, wanted to be president, didn't happen. The issue rose again with John F. Kennedy. How could you be a paid up member of the Roman Catholic Church, acknowledging the authority of the Pope and all the rest of it, and be the president of the United States, which sees no authority beyond the Constitution? And of course, the argument is you can. How? Well, because the way in which institutions see their conception of the good changes. And Murray was interesting because he obviously had an impact on some aspects of the Second Vatican Council, which created space It's a contested view, but created space for freedom of conscience, and therefore acknowledging the claims of pluralism. So Rawls's point is, that's interesting, because now we see, a kind of core liberal idea cropping up in, the teaching of the church, which they haven't gone back on, and where that isn't simply a kind of pragmatic holding position until such a point as we can take over the world and make everybody, Roman Catholics. There is this sort of acknowledgement. So his point is, if you can look at it see it in some places, there is an empirical challenge to people who say, no, it's the good all the way down, and you can't separate the right and the good, and therefore grounds for accommodation without full recognition of value systems. So does that work? How do you then cash that out? As I say, that's kind of the open project of a political liberal order, and how you square the internal logic of Rawls's theory, which was your first question, but also the implications of that for a viable liberal political order. And I think the story isn't finished, but it's not obviously one that must fail or can't be done. And I think that's the reaction to somebody like McIntyre says, we just can't do it. These are just incremental worldviews, and you're one thing or you're another, and you can't be both. Well, yeah, you can.
I think he calls that reasoning from conjecture, no, in the Law of Peoples.
It is, yes. Yeah.
I hope he's right about that, because that's the whole point of my PhD thesis. So I hope it's possible.
Yeah, but I think just a final point. I mean that it's a bit like it's a sort of cop out in the classroom, and it's a philosophical cop out. But then you've got to remember that the point of this is a political project, and that one has to remember that the change in Rawls's theory from a theory of justice, Kantian constructivism in the middle, and then the statement of political liberalism is very radical, and not everybody sees that radical shift, that reframing of it. And when you see this as now, a fundamentally political project, yes, there is the element of it coming out of rethinking the problem of stability from part 3 of a theory of justice, but it is a radical point, because he does think ultimately this is about politics.
I think the description of liberalism as being a perpetually incomplete project is a good one. The last question I want to ask you is, I want to quote the very last sentence of your book. You say, the solution to the problem of neoliberalism can only come from within liberalism and not from beyond it. Now, I had my own interpretation of what you meant by that, but perhaps it's just better for me to ask you rather than impose my own interpretation. What do you mean by that? What sort of liberalism do you see as getting us out of the neoliberal problem?
Right. So I suppose the first and fundamental point I wanted to make in that quote goes back to the just previous point about liberalism being an unfinished project. The crucial thing, both for me as a teacher, but also someone who is interested in, a viable liberalism, a viable political liberalism, is this is an ongoing debate, okay? And not then to close down debate. So, well, liberalism is just that thing. Clearly that doesn't work. We need something else. And that has been, that was the way I was educated. I kind of went through from the 80s, the liberal communitarian debate. I read McIntyre. I think he's really interesting. But it's like that. You got to choose, right? This isn't going anywhere. We've got to find something else. We either go back to traditionalism or we look for. That's not the challenge, the question, or the only way forward. So that was the first thing. And then what is going to be the debate? Well, I suppose I was sort of moving towards that when I was looking at, I mean, the last part of the book is a bit sort of hand waving, rather than my theory of liberalism. One, because I kind of wrote that 20 years ago, and I'm still a liberal egalitarian of sorts. And if it comes to it, we'll end up, arguing about rules and not talking and so on. But it was a response to people like Samuel Moyne and Alex Kahan and so on, who want to say, that what liberalism needs to do is find a conception of the good and become a fighting creed. And the way it becomes a fighting creed is to find a conception of the good. I don't think that. I think the way it needs to deal with the fundamental challenges, first and foremost, is to think long and hard about implementing, the sort of things that Rawls identifies quite early on with the difference principle, the basic liberties and their priority, and thinking about the level of egalitarianism, of, legitimate variation in wealth that is consistent with maintaining a stable liberal order. This takes me back to the anti-oligarchy point about contemporary politics. I think not just liberals, but quite a lot of people in the United States start to see that some kind of super egregious inequalities in wealth and subsequent power undermine the workings of a broadly constitutional settlement, let alone a liberal settlement. Republicans had always argued this. This is goes back to ancient times, But I think that challenge of entrenched oligarchy has to be dealt with, I think, through some form of redistribution or capping the power of wealth. So that's the way I would look at it, rather than looking at the common good. How do you do that? That's the political challenge. And the liberal argument for doing that is then going to be one of saying this is necessary for the possibility of, any real conception of citizen equality and, a broadly liberal justifiable order. Because once you have so much wealth and the power that goes with it, and you can control the institutions of government, you're not part of a political community. You're outside of it. You're a sort of threat to the stability of community. So, a fair scheme of social cooperation, however we want to describe what it is that a liberal order is, state, nation, whatever, this fair scheme cannot persist when inequalities become too great. So that's where I would sort of say the real focus needs to be paid to. And that's both philosophically, I think there's a lot that my colleagues in political science can contribute here. It's not a benign matter, whereas others might think wealth, inequalities of wealth are. I don't see that. I think they distort politics.
This sounds like it sort of mirrors Rawls's own thinking, where he kind of, in Justice's Fairness, kind of admits that his principles of justice will probably not be instantiated in a capitalist economy. And I'm sure you're familiar with the book John Rawls, A Reticent Socialist. So, and this sort of outgrowth of liberal socialism, sort of trying to merge these two traditions of thought. But it sounds like what you're saying is we need more economic redistribution and sort of social democratic economic policies.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I think you're right. Working through the implications of that for real world politics is hugely challenging, but that is the challenge. And without that, I think liberal order, but by that I also mean a sort of broadly democratic order, is at risk. And the alternative is oligarchy.
Well, on that, I completely agree. And I think it's quite interesting that the flow of this conversation has kind of sort of dovetailed with previous, I interviewed Matt McManus about his book on liberal socialism. So it sounds like there's a lot of, there's an overlapping consensus emerging on this issue. And the call for a more left-wing liberalism might be the perfect place to wrap up today's episode. Paul Kelly, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. It was a great pleasure talking to you, and always interesting to talk about these issues. So thank you.